Hey guys, super excited to be here and have a chance to speak to everyone about something I think is pretty important to the ecosystem, and I'm primarily here to kind of learn from you guys. So my name is Lane Redig. I am a core developer on the EWASM team, so I'm working on some super low-level stuff in the Ethereum stack, basically as low as you can go. That's the virtual machine stuff. But in a previous life, I was actually I guess I should say a Web 2 full stack developer, built consumer applications on web and mobile, so I definitely identify with a lot of the stuff that you guys are talking about and kind of the problems that Web 3 developers are facing today. That's a lot of my inspiration for some of the stuff I'm going to talk about. Yeah, a couple more quick disclaimers. Like, this is super new. This is an idea that was literally born less than 2 weeks ago, and I've been kind of shopping it around to some people. Several of you here have already heard me talk about this, but I have not raised a single dollar for this yet. Don't have any sexy branding, and basically this is the first time I've ever spoken about this. So yeah, kind of bear with me, and we'll just kind of dive in. This is, there's some UX to this, there's some kind of data and tech stuff to this as well. So just starting with the big picture, so we're talking about data here, right? This is stuff you guys already are familiar with, obviously, but we're in a world today where data is very siloed increasingly. The Facebooks, the Googles of the world, the Equifaxes of the world have become a massive re-centralization vector around things like identity. And I don't know about you guys, but I guess this is probably not a hard sell to this crowd, but like, I think the situation is pretty awful right now. I think that's part of my inspiration for working on Ethereum. And just to go one step further in this, I believe that data is quickly becoming, if it's not already, sort of the most valuable resource in the world. You often hear this quote, data is the new oil. And I think because it's locked in these silos, users, everyday people kind of have no way to unlock that data, to share that data, to pass it around. And I think that's kind of unfair. I think it's kind of a crappy situation. And I think to the extent that we're building a better future and sort of vision for new financial systems and financial inclusion and all this kind of lovely stuff, I think it would be silly of us not to sort of think about data in this context. So let me describe the problem first kind of from the application developer perspective. So I've had pretty lengthy conversations with some of you folks here who are building things like wallets. And what I've heard resoundingly is that getting data out of Ethereum today is much harder than it should be. You need a full node. You need at least one experienced Ethereum developer to build some stuff on top of that full node to allow you to extract things like, let's just talk about ERC20 token balances. It's a very simple kind of concept. It should be easy to get this data, but it turns out it's not. One problem is that not all of the ERC20 contracts sort of fully or accurately implement the ERC20 standard. Some of them sort of leave out some events and things like that. So anyway, it's a huge hassle, right? You're running one or more full nodes. Even just getting a new full node up and running today from scratch takes, I think, a couple of weeks probably. You need sort of SSD. It's almost impossible now to do it with a hard drive, and it's expensive and it's a pain in the butt. And sort of the most important point I want to make is like, you guys, front-end developers, designers, like, you just shouldn't have to worry about this. Like I said, I've built sort of applications in the Web 2 traditional world, and the thought of like, I have to run a backend and I have to manage a full node and I have to build another layer to extract data, it just doesn't make any sense, right? It's silly, and I think that the reason that Web 2 has come so far is because of awesome tools like Parse and Heroku and all these kind of layers that just make it possible for front-end developers to focus on front-end problems. So I've spoken to a number of the teams here and at the conference over the past few days. Casa and Balance are two awesome wallet companies developing amazing wallet software. Aragon, you guys have, what was the number we heard yesterday? 1,200, 2,400 contracts, DAOs now on Rinkeby? Yeah. 2,800 contracts deployed on Rinkeby, I guess, right? And I understand that you guys, we spoke about this, right? You guys are struggling to kind of do event snapshotting and pull data out, and you're having, yeah, okay, it's a pain in the butt for pretty much everybody, I think. And just as a corollary here, analytics, this has come up a couple times already today. Super important. Not a whole lot has been done with analytics up to now, so I'm sure many of you have heard of the Supermax project by now. They were one of the contestants yesterday in the pitch contest. I think it's awesome. They're working with you guys at Aragon. They're working with LivePeer to sort of build something resembling an analytics layer on top of smart contracts. So if CryptoKitties wants to know how many kitties were bred yesterday, they can kind of use this tool. But they also struggle to get data. I was talking about this yesterday with them. Okay, problem 2. We're relying on very centralized providers. So this is ironic, right? We're all here building this beautiful, awesome, amazing, like decentralized ecosystem and, making noise about decentralization, but like the reality is that everyone's using Etherscan, everyone's using Infura. All due respect to these teams, genuinely, I think they've added an enormous amount of value to the ecosystem. I think that, again, many of us here rely on them for a reason, but I just think looking forward, like we need something decentralized. We need something more sustainable and more scalable for the long term. And to drive the point home from Beltran's presentation just a moment ago, he mentioned, right, for a DApp to be trusted, its code needs to be trusted. So what does that mean right now? Today, that means you deploy your contract, and then you upload the code to Etherscan, and Etherscan verifies it and puts a little check mark on it. But we're trusting Etherscan. Etherscan's awesome, right? I don't think they're malicious, but it's about trust is what I'm trying to get at here. Problem 3. So this is related. It's tangential. This is not so much from the app developer perspective. This is from the perspective of people running nodes. It's gotten expensive. So actually, this is kind of crazy. So one of the reasons it's gotten expensive is that the transaction count has skyrocketed recently. Awesome. People are using Ethereum. I like that, but it's getting harder to run a full node. The number of nodes has dropped 50% in the past 3 months, 4 months, since January, 5 months. Just stop and think about that for a second, right? We went from 30,000 nodes. I just checked. We're at 15,000 today. That's pretty troubling, if you ask me. That's centralization. I mean, we have 15,000. It's not a crisis immediately, but it's going to keep getting harder. And there's multiple threads here in the Ethereum research community. This is from the ETH research discourse forum, if you're familiar with that, about incentivizing people to run full nodes as it gets more expensive to do so. Some interesting ideas out there. And in fact, there is an EIP for this as well. It's brand new. It was created on March 1st, and I think we're going to be discussing this on the All Core Devs call next week. So again, just a hot topic. So I'm going to try to describe an idea, a protocol that I think could solve most or hopefully all of these problems, these related problems. So it's called Odin. This is a brand new name. You saw it here first. It comes from Open Data Initiative or Open Data Interchange. Odin is a Germanic Norse god who is, among other things, the god of wisdom, and he sends out these ravens to collect information. So I kind of think there's an interesting kind of connection there to like decentralization of collecting data. Decentralize the. I think our nodes are going to be called ravens. It could be kind of fun. So yeah, this, as I said, this presentation is super new. This is not super deep, but just to give you guys a high-level overview of what this looks like from the perspective of the person running a full node. So I'm already running an Ethereum node. I'm running Parity. I'm running Geth. And I add a thin layer on top of this, which is the Odin client, or the Raven, I guess we could call it. And it doesn't require, basically the marginal cost for running this on top of an existing Ethereum node is very tiny, right? It's not sort of requiring that much additional bandwidth or CPU or storage. And it has some sort of a database, so this is not really like the level DB kind of low-level thing that lives inside the full node. This is something I have yet to work this out. CouchDB is something I'm looking at that could be interesting because it allows stuff like MapReduce. And then there's this protocol. And the idea is the client sort of collects data, pulls it out of the full node. The Odin client pulls this data out, indexes it, and makes it available to the protocol and allows you to collect rewards by monetizing that data. We'll walk through a more specific example in a second, but that's the high-level idea. So yeah, let me just pause for a second. And a question that often comes up at this point is, cool, this is interesting, but it's always worth asking, right? Why would this be better decentralized? Couldn't you just do this in a centralized way? And to be clear, there are a number of teams working on centralized solutions to the data problem in Ethereum. I've spoken to several of them. And I'll just run through why I think it makes sense to do this in a decentralized fashion. The first is trust, which I already mentioned before. by definition, if you pull your data from a trusted provider, whether it's an Infura, an Etherscan, any of the others, you're implicitly trusting that the data that they're giving you is complete and hasn't been tampered with. The protocol I'm describing here is trustless. Number two, reliability. Again, from conversations I've had with wallet providers, Etherscan's awesome, but if it goes down, if they're doing maintenance, then all the wallets in the whole world stop providing token balances to their users for a few hours. That kind of sucks. Again, we're building something better than that, so let's decentralize all the things. Interoperability, we have, again, all these sort of centralized people beginning to build out kind of their own data standards, interchange formats. I think we can do better by having a sort of a single standard, a single protocol. Liquidity is something we talk about a lot in the context of tokens and finance and stuff, but I think if data is the new oil, then we should be talking about how to exchange that data in a liquid way and have kind of deep markets around that data, maybe tokenize some of that data. And I think, again, a decentralized network of providers providing data will, by definition, always have more liquidity than a single individual centralized provider. And finally, openness. I think by now, Bitcoin and Ethereum have proven, at least to me, that the way forward is open APIs. Richard, you have a term you put together called an open data interface, right? So an answer to an API is like an ODI or OPI, open protocol interface. We're getting there. Cool. Yeah, so let's open up all the things as well. So what is this protocol? What does it do? So you are a full node. As I said, you're running this client. You stake some tokens to participate. Your data gets sort of sold on the market. You get paid for providing that data. And this is very, very high level. Obviously, there's a lot of details to be filled in. And malicious behavior here results in slashing. Malicious behavior would be like, providing incomplete data, tampering with the data. If this sounds similar, it's sort of very inspired by the work that's being done on Casper. I think a point to make here is that the ideas we need to solve this sort of a problem, I think, didn't exist until very recently in any sort of a solid form. But I think that they're coming together, and we're at a place right now where kind of the ideas around incentivization and TCRs and things like that I'll talk about are just all beginning to come together. So this is a good time to be talking about this stuff. All right, so yeah, let's quickly kind of walk through this in slightly more concrete terms. So if I'm the data supplier, so I am, I could be an Infura or an Etherscan or any of the other lovely teams here that are already they have their own full node infrastructure up and running. So I already have my full node. I download this open source Odin client. I specify a wallet address where I want to sort of receive rewards. I have to stake some tokens, as I mentioned. That's to keep people on their best behavior. I want this to be as dead simple as possible, right? So one thing I'd probably want you to do is to specify how many system resources you'd like this app to consume. Are you comfortable giving 10 gigabytes, 100 gigabytes, how much CPU, et cetera? The idea here being the more you sort of commit to the indexer and to this software, the more data will be sold on this marketplace and the more fees you could theoretically collect. And that's it. Again, the sort of marginal effort and cost on top of running a full node should be minimal. From your perspective, from the perspective of kind of the app, the consumer, I fire up a piece of software, a front-end piece of software, let's call it a wallet app, and it needs to get my ERC20 token balances. So this is a concrete example. So it makes a request to the Odin network, and it specifies some parameters like the token or list of tokens or all tokens and maybe my public key. And there's some sort of a bidding mechanism. So one of the pieces to be worked out here is sort of the price part, but again, keeping this slightly high level. The protocol is, you could think about this a little bit like 0x protocol or like a decentralized exchange protocol, right? So there's some sort of a matching mechanism that happens. It makes a connection between someone who has that data or multiple people who have that data on the one hand and the consumer who is bidding for that data. And then it makes the connection, so maybe it hands back an address or an IP address or something like that to the consumer. And then the data itself probably should be moved over something like a state channel because data, there can be a lot of data, and we want to maybe allow payments to flow over the state channel as well. I don't think that most of this needs to run on chain. I think that some of the incentive mechanisms will, but I think the data itself and the payments don't need to. There's a case to be made for keeping a state channel open over time if you want to do ongoing exchange of data. There's a proof part. This is really important. This is where the trustlessness comes from, right? So if I receive that data, I should be able to verify beyond the shadow of a doubt that the data is complete, it's accurate, it hasn't been tampered with, and I'll describe in a moment ways we might do that. So I verify it as a consumer, and if everything checks out, I make some payment, and if not, I can submit a fraud proof, and the person who provided that data will be punished. So let's talk about some of the challenges that this idea faces. As I said, it's half-baked. I'll be upfront about that, and I'd love to learn from you guys on some of these points. So I think the biggest challenge is actually the proof piece. I can see it in the just on the horizon. I kind of know that we can get there, but I'm still working out exactly how. So these are a few approaches. In theory, I think it's possible to do this using zero-knowledge proofs, that the provider providing the data should be able to create some sort of a ZK snark or a CK Stark or something like that, so that when the consumer receives the data, they can run that and know in a non-interactive fashion that, again, as I said, the data is complete, the data is has not been tampered with. Another possibility, a slightly simpler possibility here, is instead of the consumer requesting data from one supplier, let's say they requested from 3 or 5 or something like that, and there's some interesting algorithms we can run and say, okay, if one of them disagrees, then most likely that one had some sort of an issue, and again, we'd submit this information back to some sort of on-chain contract as a fraud proof. And finally, again, there's echoes here of other projects. So another of them is TrueBit. I think that it's very inspired by the work TrueBit's doing on challenge response games and verifiers and things like that. So I think that this could be done, maybe even using TrueBit, sort of a specialized version of TrueBit. A few more challenges. So the incentive part, that's obviously a work in progress as well. As a sort of protocol designer, mechanism designer, that's kind of the stuff that I'm thinking about, the piece of this that's very interesting to me. Fault tolerance is important, right? I said reliability before. If if 1 or 2 or n sort of data providers or suppliers in the network go offline or go down or provide bad data, we need to be able to recover from that. Pricing and discovery is tricky. We need to figure out sort of the right way to do that and make sure that suppliers are being paid fairly and consumers are not being overcharged for data. And finally, the ontology of the data is tricky. Data is complex. I'm using ERC20 tokens as an example because it's something we all understand. But there's an infinite number of ways to mix and match data and perform analysis on top of data and stuff like that. So semantic web is kind of one approach that might be useful here. Finally, let's look at what this would look like going forward. So first few steps, as I said, this is an open source project. I've been in touch with a few people about it. There is a GitHub repo organization, and a Gitter channel. I'll show the link for that in a second. I think we're going to begin setting up weekly or bi-weekly calls because there's a few interested parties here. Continue talking to more data providers, continue talking to more data consumers. I'm very much of the mindset that rather than try to boil the ocean, rather than go off and do an ICO and raise money, I would just like to see a basic end-to-end prototype of this working. And I know that, again, a couple of the folks I've spoken to here who are working on things like wallets, as well as folks who are building some data indexing solutions. So shout out to TJ and his team, right? They've got a really exciting solution here called QuickBlocks. I think we can get a prototype of this working, and again, without all the bells and whistles, but just a basic kind of prototype working in the order of weeks, not months or years. Beginning to put together pieces of a white paper, and just get that kind of Odin client, open source client written. Data is interesting, right? So again, I'm keeping things really simple here and saying there's only a single client, but actually there's many roles and many layers to data. You could envision a much more complex market in the future where there's someone who extracts the data. There's another role here where someone comes in and filters the data and sorts the data in certain ways or recombines the data, right? Performing some interesting analysis on the data. There could be a storage market, which should sound something like IPFS and Filecoin, request handling, routing, et cetera, et cetera. So there's many parts of this that could be unpacked, but I'm keeping it simple for now. I think structured queries are really important from the application perspective. One of the topics that comes up again and again is GraphQL. I think it's pretty sexy. If you guys haven't used it in your apps yet, I highly recommend checking it out. This is sort of the holy grail for me. Imagine being able to query Ethereum data using GraphQL. That's kind of, for me, that's kind of head exploding. That would be amazing if we can make that work. I think there's a lot of opportunities here to play with TCRs and prediction markets. I'm personally a bit obsessed with this idea. It's unproven, but I think allowing people to kind of stake on which pieces of data, parts of data, what type of analysis would be valuable in the future could be really, really exciting. And this is bigger than Ethereum. I think that we'll start there because that's our home base and we have sort of immediate use cases, but there's no reason that we wouldn't be able to use this for other chains or even non-blockchain data. I'll leave you with 2 final thoughts. I'm a huge fan of mining, like huge fan of mining. I'm less of a fan of ICOs. I'm less of a fan of airdrops. They have their place, but as far as getting people, enfranchised in a project and winning hearts and minds of a community, the idea of being able to download a piece of software and run it and create value and immediately begin collecting tokens in exchange is awesome. Like, I just don't think anything beats that. I love that Bitcoin did it in a very pure way. And what excites me so much about this is that, Bitcoin and Ethereum are wasting a lot of electricity, right? That mining is not going anywhere useful. This is really elegant because what you're mining is data, right? You're immediately creating value. We don't need to create any sort of weird, ASIC resistant algorithms. This is by definition ASIC resistant because data is going to come in all shapes and forms and sizes. And that doesn't work in the Ethereum main chain because of various issues around long-range attacks and incentives and things like that. But we don't have that issue here because we're verifying data, or we're mining data from another chain. So again, I just think it's an elegant form of mining. And finally, I think Bitcoin decentralized value in a big, exciting way. I think Ethereum has decentralized applications, but I don't think that anyone has solved data yet. I think that, IPFS Filecoin, BigChainDB, BlueZella, some of these projects are moving in the right direction, but no one has managed to connect the dots around sourcing data in particular, not just sort of saving my own data. So that is kind of my vision for this project. And yeah, this is so the working name has been Ethereum ODI. ODI is, as I said, Open Data Initiative. I like the name Odin. I don't know. Does anyone hate that name? Okay, cool. That's cool. There you go. All right. So I'm probably going to rename this, but check it out and join the conversation here. Thanks, guys.
We have time for exactly 1 question.
I feel like I feel like it's a data indexing problem, and what are the benefits of doing it as a protocol on top of full nodes instead of just having these features incorporated in parity or Geth?
We have some parity engineers here. Maybe you guys could. I mean, look, I think
I feel like I should just be able to send GraphQL to parity and get the data out, instead of having to rely on additional layer on top of it.
Yeah. So my perspective on this as a core developer is that it's just not realistic in the short term. There's just so much. There's a huge backlog of stuff that needs to be done at the protocol layer. We have our hands on. We're just very distracted by things like proof of stake and Casper and sharding and stuff right now. And this can be done at layer 2. So maybe that's the right place to start. But I don't know if you guys feel otherwise. I'd love to hear about it. Not just Ethereum as well, yeah.
I was just wondering, I think a year ago there was an effort to put all Ethereum stuff on IPFS, and that should be also one mechanism where we have already with Filecoin the ability that the data, at least on that level, is available easier. I know you want to do more, but I was just wondering what's the status there? Is there something happening? Is that complementary?
I think TJ may have something to say about this. I know you've looked into this.
So I'm really about the decentralizing the data part, as you know, and I'm really close to the node, so I'm using the node heavily to get the data, and I'm finding that there's things in the node that could probably be improved. So there might be some things. I think one of the things you might be missing there is feeding back to the node what would make it easier to get the data to begin with. So I think that's another part of this process. And then IPFS has some really interesting qualities, so I think there's a lot to explore with IPFS and this data. In particular, if you looked at the size of the data grow, I think it's kind of obvious to me that at some point you just have to cut off history at some point. If we all can store it somewhere, for example, IPFS, we haven't thrown out history, but we can remove it from the nodes perhaps. And I'm just thinking thoughts like that.